people.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for overview of tariffs. My name is Taya Brown. I am the administrative coordinator here at the Temple SBDC. The Temple SBDC is a part of a nationally accredited network of 1,000 SBDCs across the United States. You have joined us for overview of tariffs on small businesses. The presenter today will be Richard Voith. This session is being recorded, and we will send out a follow email within 2 to 3 business days with additional materials. Now I'll turn over the floor to Richard.
Okay, thanks very much, Taya. And it's a pleasure to speak to the folks who I can't see. It'd be delightful if I could see you all, but it's nice to be here with an opportunity to talk. So a little bit about myself before we get going. So first of all, I am an economist by training. I spent 15 years working in the Federal Reserve System. So I've looked at economic issues for a long time, but not just macroeconomics, but I've focused mainly on cities in most of my professional life. After I left the Fed now 25 years ago, so I'm old. I have a consulting firm here located in Philadelphia called Econsult Solutions, Inc., and we're ESI for short. We focus mainly on the intersection between the public and private sectors. Most of our work is focused on urban-related issues, whether they be real estate, transportation, income inequality, the range of things, housing, the range of issues that make cities either livable or unlivable. What makes them good places are productive places, and how to work with cities to make them better places overall as time goes by. So I'm happy, and just as we have this this webinar, it is my most serious desire to make it as conversational as possible, so that if we can, we do not have to go for 40 minutes worth of time before we have a 20-minute question and answer period. I'd much rather respond to questions and concerns, and I think Tara can help us do that as we go through. So having said that, so I've been in Philadelphia for a long time. I've been interested in economics of cities for a long time. Tariffs are an old topic. And I'm going to pull up a tariff. You can make the PowerPoint, which is going to be short and sweet and not particularly attractive, but it'll keep me on track, and it'll also give you an idea of where we're supposed to be as we talk through this. So can you do that, Tara?
If you go to the section that says slideshow at the top, you should be able to present.
Yeah, I see your screen sharing, and I don't see a slideshow. So, okay,
and then from begin, yes.
Okay, got it. Okay, so there we go. So let's talk about tariffs and small business. That's the topic of this. And okay, so you ever, I'm sure you've always heard the notion that there's never, there aren't one-handed economists, because they're always saying on the one hand there's this, and on the other hand that's that, and they always disagree. Well, tariffs are not that. There has been a broad consensus for well over 100 years about tariffs. And I will summarize it this on the slide that you're looking at. My profession is convinced, both from a theoretical and empirical perspective, that tariffs are bad for consumers and they're bad for businesses. Tariff costs are passed on to consumers, but they, in the process of passing on the cost of consumers, which businesses have to do because they have to pay the higher cost of goods, they lower sales for businesses, and the net result of that is lower profits and incomes for small businesses. It's pretty hard to escape those conclusions. And we'll talk a little bit about some patterns that have been seen in the past. The other thing is tariffs tend to lower incomes and wealth in both the countries setting the tariffs and the countries that have actually are sending goods to the U.S. Tariff wars are predictable. The U.S. puts a tariff on someone, the response is to put a tariff on others. What that means is that both countries, you are putting tariffs on one another, and you don't trade goods with the other country, even if that other country can make it for a lot cheaper than you can, and that you can make something else that for cheaper than they can. You don't trade, everyone ends up worse off. And yeah, the government may collect a little bit of money, but it is trivial with respect to the economic damage from a macro perspective. The tariffs result in economists always concerned about how we actually allocate our resources. And tariffs result in resources going to places where you don't necessarily want them to go. If you have a very low cost producer, and you say, I'm going to do it myself, and it costs you 5 times as much to produce, on net, you're making fewer things for the same amount of money, and what you've done is you've wasted your country's resources. So this inefficiency results in lower profits, number one, and number two, fewer jobs because the overall economy has to shrink, except for there may be some industries that are protected that don't shrink. And there's a lot of evidence about, even for those industries, they're protected. They don't have to innovate. They don't have to grow. They don't have to improve. And when tariffs are then taken off and the protection disappears, they look very bad compared to their competition, and they do poorly. So they have long run negative impacts. And there's some examples here of tariffs. So one of the things I said, this tariffs have had a bad rep for a long time. The Great Depression, which no one talks about it because there have been so many intervening events since then that have been bad and dominate our focus. But the Great Depression in the 1930s was really bad, and it was disastrously bad. And there is a pretty strong consensus that the Great Depression was not caused by tariffs, but was made infinitely worse by tariffs. There was something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which raised tariffs on 20,000 imported goods, which is a big number back in that day, to record levels. In some cases, more than 60%. And it basically resulted, it was trying to protect U.S. farmers and industry from foreign competition with these 60% tariffs. But global trade, both directions, plummeted by more than 65% because other countries retaliated, and basically there was no trade. U.S. exports totally collapsed. Bankruptcies surged. People lost their jobs. They lost their fortune. They lost their people who had real financial resources, lost it all, and basically stock market crash. And that global fragmentation resulted in a worldwide shrinkage of production. And ultimately, what you hear about in tariffs nowadays with respect to the Trump tariffs is, well, it's just going to cause more inflation. And that is the most likely outcome of a tariff at this point. Although if tariffs result in global trade wars such that the worldwide economy falls, then not only do you would not get inflation at that point, you get prices falling because you know what, incomes are falling even faster. So the real cost of everything is rising, but they can be that destructive to an economy. And you see a little bit of that. You see it in China right now, where they're struggling with deflation. They can't, prices are falling in part because they don't have enough outlets to sell the goods and services that they need to have, and they don't have enough domestic income to support the industries. So, and the other thing about the world is everything isn't competition. Part of things is cooperation, and international cooperation is really quite useful. So we've been very fortunate. We were very fortunate, at least for a while, from let's say 1980 through 2010. It was a pretty good time in the U.S. to, especially for cities, they prospered. They've gone from really decline to prospering again. Globally, worldwide, it was a very cooperative time relative to other times, just put it that way. And 2 billion people went from subsistence living to actually having a livable income. It's huge. That's a huge win for the world. Doesn't say anything about neighborhoods in Philadelphia, but it's a win for the world. The breakdown in international cooperation has effects that show up locally, ultimately, and almost inevitably. So when you think about, I've already said that tariffs are bad. There's a consensus for that. When you look at the impacts of more recent tariffs in 2018-19, there were the Trump tariffs that the National Bureau of Economic Research publishes papers by academics, and they're basically the kind of cutting edge of economics. There's an estimate that 300,000 jobs, U.S. jobs, were lost due to the 2018-19 tariffs. And when jobs are lost, small businesses suffer. Some of those jobs are at small businesses, but some of those jobs are people who purchase goods and services from those small businesses. Main Street businesses, restaurants, real repair shops, basically they all struggle to deal with higher supply costs. And when they struggle, then their employees struggle, and the net result is not a pretty one. So there's just a lot of evidence over time, and even with the tariffs really cause problems for local economies, and in particular, right now when we're talking about a world where we are thinking about tariffs amongst our near neighbors, China and Mexico, Canada and Mexico, our longtime neighbor, trading partners in Europe, and one of our largest trading partners in China. And there's all kinds of issues associated with that and reasons. Those things are going to be costly to the U.S. economy. I have a good friend of mine has this is a real kind of exciting business. He sells plastic bags. He buys them from domestic and importing suppliers, and he has him and his son run the business. It's a small business, and they have successful business. They're getting killed on tariffs because their supply costs with their Chinese produced bags have gotten so high. So they're getting hurt pretty badly. That small firm. But these things are, the economy is big, complicated, and, in the US, there's a supplier of almost everything. And those suppliers most of them don't make everything that they sell themselves. They buy it from someone else, or they buy parts of it from someone else and they assemble it into something new, or they buy food from farms that get produced by farmers who hire labor that comes from everywhere, and they make food to these restaurants make food to sell to us here in Philadelphia, and these things just cascade down to affecting lots of people. So tariffs will start off by basically driving up prices, the cost of supplying for small businesses, almost impossible to avoid. And there was a famous quote, not a famous quote, but it was a quote that was made a week ago, for those people who might know who Warren Buffett is. He's one of the many billionaires there seem to be around now, but Warren Buffett is a really pretty decent guy. And he was asked, well, are tariffs going to drive prices up? And his response was his typical folksy self. He said, well, I don't think the tooth fairy is going to pay them. Someone's going to pay them. So this idea that somehow you can have tariffs on things without having price impacts, which are then be turned into production impact, cost impacts, which then turn into job impacts. It's tariffs are not good. And it's one of the few things that almost every economist agrees upon. So let's talk a little bit specifically about, okay, so we have, you guys in small businesses, you must be wondering, some of you probably buy imported goods, you're wondering, well, what the hell is a tariff? I hear 25% tariff, a 10% tariff. I have a tariff 1 week and I don't have a tariff next week. And by the way, it is completely uncertain about where we're going with tariffs. No one knows, because they change depending on time of day and what day of the week it is and what week it is. There has been kind of a lot of work that's actually looked at uncertainty in tariffs. And the bottom line is uncertainty is challenging to businesses. You guys, small businesses, my firm's a small business, not tiny, but it's small by any classification standards. We have 30 people. Excuse me. The uncertainty is really hard to deal with. You have to make decisions about what you're going to do in the future. And where are you going to get your goods and services? If you're selling goods, do you preemptively saying, oh, there's going to be a 50% tax on Chinese goods, I better go and preemptively build a relationship with a supplier that's not in China, so I don't pay a tariff that's that big, so that I can actually get goods into my store that my customers can afford. And that sounds like a kind of a relatively straightforward question, except for it's not, because you don't know what the tariffs are for other people are going to be. It's uncertain. That's number one. And the other thing about tariffs is that the world is incredibly complex in its interrelationships among people. You may have a business in North Philadelphia or in West Philadelphia and deal with clientele that is, coming from 1 to 2 miles from your store predominantly. But the goods that you're coming from are coming from Canada, Mexico, China, India, Vietnam. And it's not just the one good. Things are going back and forth and back and forth. A car gets made in the US, that car has parts that come to Mexico, come from Mexico. And some of those parts come from Mexico go to Canada, come to the United States, and get changed, come to the United States, get added to another component of the card, ship back to Mexico, and then come back again. And these supply chains are incredibly complex. And when you start talking about tariffs, people and businesses just sort of throw up their hands. And ultimately, that all shows up as cost to a small business. Because the people who are making investment decisions about the products that you sell are pricing into the goods that they sell you, all the uncertainty that they are, and plus they're not making investments in technology and in production that they would otherwise, because they have no idea about the profitability of doing so. So the complexity of the supply chains is kind of overwhelming, and it makes adjustments to supply chains really costly, which means that the end small business user of products, excuse my French, is often totally screwed. So, and for a small business itself, you're going to be less likely to invest in anything either because of the uncertainty. You don't know whether you have a return when you're very scarce capital. And no small business is as flush on capital. And so you're really loath to invest in something if you really can't even figure out what the price of what you're going to be selling and making out of that investment if you don't know. So the other thing that's odd about this that people never think about is that if you have tariffs, then you're going to end up ultimately having to make investments. So you're going to invest in places that, while appear to be an attractive investment now, they may not have, and I'm an economist, so apologize for the jargon, have a competitive advantage in the absence of tariffs. And there will be another policy person that comes in, and the tariffs will disappear. So you will put all this money into a place where all of a sudden the investment you make is a loser. So that uncertainty is really, really challenging. And ultimately, there's a quote in here, at the bottom of this slide that I'm on, if you can see it, the trade policy certainty is almost as valuable as the ability for free trade itself. So certainty is really important, and tariffs are important, but certainty about where they're going is also important. So I've been rambling for a little while now, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Is this a good time to pause and talk about concerns that the folks on this webinar might be having about tariffs, or what I've said about tariffs, or want to pick a bone with what I've said? I'm happy to entertain some questions if that is the case.
It does look like we have a few questions. The first question is, do USA-based service, not product-driven businesses such as accounting or consulting service firms, have to pay some sort of sales or other taxes for services rendered to clients in Canada, to Canadian authorities, or the United States authorities?
That is a great question. And the answer to that is I am uncertain. I mean, we've done work in Canada. We've never had any implications on that. And tariffs are often not put directly on services, although they certainly could be. And the U.S. produces a lot of services that are exported, and essentially exported. So that's a great question, and I don't think that that is the case. That there are. I am sure that I believe that Canada has some tariffs on importing some U.S. goods, and I think that's one of the reasons Mr. Trump is targeting them, because they feel that it's unfair. But I'm not sure. I think President Trump went apoplectic when Canada suggested, well, they may put a surcharge on the electricity they supply the United States. So I'm not sure where that is. I just don't know. Well, I'm just curious to the person who asked that question. Does he have a particular thing in mind?
John, if you have anything additional to add to the question, please feel free to drop it in the chat.
Okay. Oh, by the way, we've also done business in China, and things were not sufficiently transparent that I would know that whether I paid a tax or anything. I just wouldn't know. So it was all rolled up into a final price. I have no idea how much of that went to the company I was working for, how much went to the government, no idea.
Okay, for that question, John says no particular business model in mind, perhaps recruitment firm and recruitment services for businesses and individuals.
Recruitment services, meaning collection services? I doubt if they're taxed. Just you need to talk to an expert. So another question, perhaps?
The next question is, will the proposed Trump tariffs impact current tax, sales, or other taxes for small service businesses?
Will they, read it again for me, Taya, please? Thank
Will
you.
the proposed Trump tariffs impact current sales tax or other taxes for small service businesses?
Well, so that's that is a very good question. So if Trump puts a tax, a tariff on a good that a small business sells, and it goes from $100 to $125. They put a 25% tax on it. And what happens when you put that tax on? Well, first of all, when small business sells that good, assuming he or she still can, you're gonna have to pay the 8% tax that applies in Philadelphia for that product, unless talking about clothing. So your taxes that you will be paying on that will be on top of the tariff is essentially taxed. So that's pretty clear. So it's even more. So there's that. But the fact of the matter is that tariff will not be in the longer term fully borne by the American, by the consumer in the US, because what they will do is that $125, they'll buy fewer than they would at 100, or on average, less will be sold. So you may have been selling 100 units at $100, and all of a sudden you're now selling 80 units at $125. So the business will be getting a profit on 80 units, or less, and you'll be paying taxes on it at the higher $125 rate, but you're not going to be selling as many goods and services as you were before, and your profits are almost certainly going to fall. And if your profits are already certainly going to fall, then it's likely that you're not going to be able to employ the same number of people in your local business, which means that the community is going to have fewer jobs. And as you can think about this thing, it turns into a vicious cycle. So now there may be domestic alternatives that you can turn to that are worth sell for $115 rather than $125 with the tax price. In which case, you would switch to the domestic production, and your customers wouldn't pay as much more, but they'll still be paying more. You'll still be selling less than you were before, and you'll be worse off. That supplier might get a short-term boom from that because they're suddenly competitive where they weren't competitive before. But there are not a lot of suppliers that are in that circumstance. Because the way the World Organization for supplying commodities is they're done by fairly significant, sophisticated organizations that are producing at very high levels for many customers around the world. And the mom and pop production is much more artisan, higher end, and it's not quite so substitutable for the hardcore commodity producers. So if anyone wants to comment on those comments, that's great. Happy to. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yes, we do have a few more questions.
Great.
What is the best resources to research the current and proposed tax and tariff issues?
Another great question. So I can tell you by personal experience that if you look, you use GPT, and you put in something like economics of tariffs, or what are the impacts of tariffs on local communities, or anything related to that, will write me a summary essay of tariffs being considered by the United States. What are the impacts? You will get a very readable, very easily understood, reasonably well referenced set of things. I know this because I rely on it myself. That would be very, very helpful as a starting point for learning about tariffs. So I would highly recommend that. It's easier than ever to do in businesses like mine, that in the business consulting world, have to be very aware that nowadays you can get pretty high quality information. You have to check it and stuff like that if you're really going into some deep level, but very easily well summarized information from thought leaders on the topic. So I recommend doing that.
The next question is more so a statement, if you could provide advice. I'm trying to open a restaurant and I'm worried about how to price things with everything being uncertain since we aren't open yet.
Well, what a question. And I have, first of all, I have huge sympathy for the question. Trying to figure out how to price things is always a challenge, especially when you're entering a new area. And anytime you open a new business, restaurant's not a new area, but it's you don't know exactly what your market is. So the first thing you should ask is, if you're talking about a restaurant, tariffs can matter to you in two ways. I mean, so I'm going to focus on tariffs since that's what the topic was. One way is it is likely that tariffs are going to drive up the costs of certain things that you rely on as a restaurant, like if you want produce, fruit produce that's coming from Mexico, that's going to, be likely to be more expensive than might have been in the past. Some other things might be less expensive, but they're not going to be components that are important to your business. I mean, it may be that wheat-based products ultimately become a little cheaper because China puts on huge tariffs on grain consumption from the U.S. U.S. is gonna have to sell it somewhere, which will drive prices down. So, but those things are not important, I don't think, from the restaurant's point of view in general. The question is whether the community that you're going to be serving is going to be prospering. And I think that that's a pretty tough question to answer. I think that, and I'm going to make an assumption. I'm assuming you're talking about doing this in Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia. There are a lot of things that are, and this is a broadening the topic, that are going to adversely affect the city of Philadelphia in the Trump administration. Number one, one is tariffs, and that will affect the supply chain for a bunch of fresh food kind of stuff. Number two, excuse my cough, is that there are Philadelphia, it's no secret, it is kind of dominated by the hospitals and education kind of business industry. The Temples, the Penns, and all the other colleges, and Jefferson University Hospital, those are huge employers in Philadelphia, and they're been the engines of growth. They are more or less being challenged with new rules about federal grant making, especially for basic research in the health sciences. And I think all of those institutions are going to end up laying off a lot of people. Those are people that would be potential clients for your restaurant, number one, but they're also, even if they're not clients for your restaurant, they're clients for other places that hire people of all walks of life and all income levels who may be the people you're targeting for your restaurant. So I think that there are threats there. And another major threat is a huge amount of work is done in the restaurant industry and in a bunch of retail and a bunch of other service industries by immigrants, some of whom are illegal, many of whom are illegal. There is a real chill on in that world, and that's going to drive up the costs of doing business for businesses in Philadelphia, and that in turn is going to drive down their employment and drive down the income generated needed to support restaurants. And then you put it on top of that is that it looks pretty seriously like transit's going to be a target, and Philadelphia's a pretty transit dependent people. Even if you don't use it and you drive, there are lots of people that do drive and or don't drive who are need to get to their work. They'll be less able to, and that will cause dislocations of all sorts. So if I was thinking about opening a restaurant, which I hope you do, I'm in Philadelphia and I benefit from all the wonderful aspects of the diverse economy here. We're in for a little bit of a shock for a while.
Next question is, what options do small business owners have to address higher costs in the short term?
So, the options are pretty limited right now because you don't know what you're trying to guard against. You don't know where the tariffs are going to actually exist 2 months from now, 2 weeks from now. You don't know what goods and services they're going to be placed on. If so, that lack of knowledge makes it more difficult to even think about how do you defend against it. The uncertainty is rife. We've seen changes and changes and changes, and the reason why we're seeing that is that Trump views it as everything that happens is a transaction. It's a bargaining chip. It's a negotiation. So, if you're doing negotiation, you never start out with what you think you're going to end up with. So this is a different kind of world than we typically think of our government engaged in, where you in the past you had long-term agreements with people and you hewed closely to those agreements. And if you didn't, you were very careful in your steps away from those agreements. You tried to signal where you were going. That's clearly not the world we're in that right now. Right now we're in the world of I'm going to get the best for me. The Trump agenda, and I'm going to do it by creating a lot of chaos. And somehow I know they're going to come out ahead. I don't think that that's going to be true, but I think that's the theory. That's why you see, what's going on is they're trying to blow up things because they want the threat to make people understand that they mean what they're saying, even if they don't, and that they're willing to endure large costs to get their way.
And then second part to that question is, should they add more suppliers or buy more current inventory?
Well, that is exactly the right question, and my response to that is you don't know yet, because if you choose to take the first thing, it should be broaden your supply chain. Okay, so that's going to involve costs. You're going to have to choose people that weren't your preferred one that you're already using, but it could protect you by being diversified. That's a plus. On the other hand, that supplier that you think is protecting you may be the target of a tariff soon enough. And the other is, should you buy stuff now in anticipation for increases in the future? And really that depends on what week we were talking about, because there are times when there are going to be tariffs on Tuesday, and then tariffs on Tuesday were changed to tariffs a month from Tuesday. And had you executed that your purchase at a higher price, because at sort of early on, and you've endured some financing cost of it and stuff like that, and you would be out some. So it's the uncertainty that makes the answer to your question really difficult.
Next question is, are there particular industries or types of small businesses who are likely to be more exposed to tariff-related uncertainty or cost increases?
That's a great question, and I think that the answer to that is certainly yes, and in particular, things that are I mean, if you're a retailer of manufactured goods that are coming from Mexico, water heaters, for example, that which is a commodity, a total commodity. They're going to rise in price. If you are a contractor that is building housing of any sort, you are going to likely be affected by tariffs on Canadian lumber. That is going to be costly. There's a whole another class of things that will also affect everyone, and that is going to be how labor supply is affected, because there's going to be a chill on immigrant labor, and there's a lot of immigrant labor that's used in the construction industry, the lawn maintenance industry. Excuse me. You know, and Houston has really cheap housing construction. When you're not in Houston, but it's predominantly immigrant labor. The other thing that is going to you're going to see a cost impact is on anything that relies on, you know, the agricultural sector is going to have immigrant labor related costs that are going to be rising. So it's not just tariffs, it's a couple things.
Next part is, who should be paying the closest attention to tariff news items in your opinion?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because and I really am of two minds about that. Given the level of uncertainty about tariffs and the unlikely and you don't know, you could follow the news and drive yourself crazy by following in some kind of detail and actually learn absolutely nothing about what's going with the tariff situation that's going to be a month from now. Ignorance is seldom the best approach, so I'm not advocating ignorance, but I'm just saying, you know, there's a certain aspect of this where it's a black hole. It really shouldn't be this case. So there's not as much information in the news as you might think. Let's assume the news is absolutely accurately portrayed and done, but the proposals continually change.
The next question is, great talk so far. Could small businesses that buy directly from countries with added tariffs use the minimus rule when purchasing? That is to say, as long as the increase in the shipping costs associated with small orders that each fall under the threshold can outweigh that will be tariffs.
Right. So that's a very sophisticated question, and I don't know the answer to it. And it's a great question, and it seems like something that you should ask someone who knows better than me. But I think it's a great question. If one were to do the analytics, it's very easy, but the facts, I don't know what the facts are. So it's a great question.
Our next question is, does tariffs have any advantage over the small businesses, or is tariffs bad for small businesses?
I think tariffs are unambiguously bad for small businesses. They have very little ability to change the nature of their supply chain. As a rule, It's not because they're too stupid or they don't are not wise enough. It's just that they're trying to run a business, not manage supply chains. Um, the the small businesses are going to be confronted with consumers and customers that are dealing with an array of goods that have been tariffed, and they're going to have to spend, some are going to have to spend some resources on those tariffs, which means that there may well be less resources available to spend on whatever it is that the small business is selling. And I think that um, um, that small businesses are likely to be adversely affected more by whatever the net economic impact is on all of their customers rather than the direct impact of tariffs. Now, I could be wrong about that, but that's my opinion as it stands right now. But and that will vary very much depending on whether you're a small business that sells something that's going to be targeted as a tariff. That could be disastrous for a small business.
The next question is, would Milton Friedman or John Maynard Keynes be favorable to tariffs for small businesses today?
Okay, so I will read something that's on my screen. Milton Friedman and Ben Bernanke, who used to be the Federal Reserve Chairman, who I know, both argued that Smoot-Hawley, which was the Tariff Act during the Depression, severely worsened depression. So I'm pretty sure that Milton Friedman, whose politics is not mine, but he's a Nobel Prize winner, he's a smart guy. He is suggesting it's not a good idea. Okay, so he would say no, and I will do this by virtue of, again, reading what's right up on my screen, something else. John Maynard Keynes was a brilliant iconoclast. He took a different point of view on things and has been proven remarkably successful well past his death. A big Keynesian advocate is a guy named Paul Krugman, who you probably have read. He says about tariffs, it wasn't the main cause, but it was a significant blow to the global recovery. And he's talking about, again, Great Depression. I would argue the same thing would have applied if anyone was talking about tariffs in the 2008 recession, 2008, 9, 10 recession in the U.S. And no one was talking about tariffs then. They were all talking about how much to spend or not spend. The tariffs, in my view, right now are they're totally political. They're appealing to a base, and it's a base that doesn't really understand very well the consequences on them, and because it will have pretty big red state agricultural impacts that are negative. But I don't think that I think that tariffs are going to be generally bad. And I think that both Milton Friedman and Paul Krugman, who are on the opposite end of the political spectrum, and both are dead, so I can't be disputed by them. They can't defend themselves, or basically would agree with what I have said with respect to tariffs.
And Mr. Voigt,
Yes,
this is Mark Tucker. I just wanted to tell
Mark,
you,
do I know you? How you doing,
I
Mark?
think so. How you doing? I really appreciate you, number one, as my friend, and always, and as a competitor, and just a welcome to hear your voice and talking about this pressing subject. I just wanted to point to two things and get your opinion about it. Today, apparently, there was an investment by Hyundai of, I don't know, $20 billion in apparently manufacturing here in the United States, in Louisiana and a couple other states. And it looks to me that it was actually announced today because of all the issues around the the tariffs issue. And you mentioned a couple minutes ago, you said you got to read the news, but you also got to understand where it's coming from. Can you speak on that a little bit? And then I have one other point, just that right there. And I have one other thing, and I know we're pushing the 4 o'clock limit for you. And I really appreciate you stepping in, as sick as you are, because you are sick, buddy. And please, we'll get together and have lunch in the near future. So please talk to that.
I wish we could get together and play basketball, but I can't anymore. But yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so $20 billion is a really big number as a rule, but it's not a big number in terms of the United States economy. Okay, it is a headline number, but it is not a big number for a 300 million, 350 million person country that is, amongst the wealthiest countries in the world. It just isn't, and we don't know what the 20 billion is. It's great. I think it's good to get investment, and there will be investment as a result of the tariffs. If you can avoid the tariffs by doing an investment here, and you can find a place where that can be productive. I mean, the United States is a very productive place. On the other hand, for every kind of movement in one direction, there is a movement in another. And you may recall in the first Trump administration, the big win was the Foxconn silicone fab up in Minnesota that was supposed to be done. And I don't know, it was 20 billion, but it was 10 billion or something, a big number. Foxconn is a Chinese firm, and that never came to pass. They built a shopping mall.
Yeah.
So, there's news and there's news, and it's not just Trump. This happens on all sides of the political spectrum. But and $20 billion is a large number. It is almost 1/20th of the wealth of Elon Musk. So, you got to keep it in perspective. That's all. Yeah, another question you said.
Before the next question from Mark, we do have one more question from an attendee as well. Can the effects of tariffs be reduced by relying on local supply chains as much as possible, or will the cost be passed on even in that scenario?
Well, so that's a very good question, and thank you for asking it. So the first thing to do, give me a minute, please, is to understand that they weren't chosen to start with. Okay, so they're going to be a higher cost producer at some level. Are they much higher cost? Maybe not. You don't know, but they are going to be a higher cost, or else they would have been chosen already. They're local. Why wouldn't you? They're dependable. You know them, but they weren't. And part of the reason they weren't goes back to what I said before. A lot of the commodity businesses are done by very sophisticated, very capital-intensive businesses, where labor is a third the cost in the United States on top of that. So they're both efficient and they have cheap labor. And by the way, when you put a tax on that, one of the things it does, and no one ever wants to hear this now, but when you put a tax on those goods, what it really does is it drives down the wages of the poorest people in the world. So that's not a good outcome either, in my view. But I think I'm in the distinct minority in that. And if you won't buy it, if you're making someone making $10, $15 a day, and suddenly they have to cut 20% of their costs, and they go down to, you know, $12 a day, well, that's what will happen to them. So, you know, it's a tough world.
Hey, Dick, I truly appreciate you as always. I look forward to talking with you in the future. We really appreciate you at Temple Fox Business School, and we welcome the opportunity to talk in the future. My last question is really personal. They say there's a rumor that you were drafted by the 76ers. Is that true? I just want to make sure I get that on record.
Yeah, there's a rumor that, but you know, that is not true. I was invited to camp and to a regular season training camp and almost made it, and then Golden State, but I was not drafted. And I will give you the excuse why. I entered the competition for the league right after the American Basketball Association closed. And they had 2 rounds of draft that year.
Tara, if you want to close out, I truly appreciate it. Wanted to say thank you, Mr. Voith. Thank you for being here in Philadelphia and being a cherished member of our community. And I know you're a big transit guy. We didn't get into talking about the transit effects of the tariffs and what's going on, but we truly appreciate you. And Tara, why don't you wrap up, and then we'll talk in the future. But we'll go from there. Thank you.
So Mark and Tara both, and to the audience, it was my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for having me. I hope that some of it was perceived as useful.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Richard, for presenting. If you do have any remaining questions, feel free to reach out to us directly at sbdc@temple.edu, and we will be happy to answer any remaining questions. And we will send out a follow-up email with materials from this session. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
And thank you, Tara. Bye-bye.
You're welcome.